Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The Clown. It was a small town, the kind where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were as rare as a cold day in July. But something sinister was lurking in the shadows, something that would soon turn this quiet community into a nightmare. It all started with the arrival of the circus. The posters appeared overnight, plastered on every available surface. Big Top Bonanza. They proclaimed in bold, colorful letters, "Come one, come all, witness the greatest show on earth." The townsfolk were abuzz with excitement. It had been years since a circus had come to town, and the promise of entertainment was too good to pass up. But there was something off about the posters. The colors were too bright, almost garish, and the images seemed to shift when you looked at them too long. The clowns in particular were unsettling. Their smiles were too wide, their eyes too piercing, and then there was the main attraction, Clown 5000. The poster depicted a towering figure with a grotesque, exaggerated face, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The name was emblazoned beneath it in dripping, blood-red letters. The circus set up on the outskirts of town, in a field that had been empty for as long as anyone could remember. The Big Top was a massive structure, its red and white stripes seeming to pulse in the fading light. The air was thick with the scent of popcorn and cotton candy, but there was an underlying stench, something foul and unidentifiable. The townsfolk began to arrive as the sun dipped below the horizon, their excitement palpable. Children ran ahead of their parents, laughing and shouting, while adults chatted amiably, looking forward to a night of fun and nostalgia. But as they approached the Big Top, a strange silence fell over the crowd. The only sound was the distant calliope music, eerie and discordant. The show began with the usual fanfare, acrobats, jugglers, and trained animals. But there was something off about the performers. Their movements were too precise, too mechanical, and their smiles never reached their eyes. The audience clapped politely, but a sense of unease began to creep in. Then came the clowns. They burst onto the scene in a flurry of color and noise, their oversized shoes slapping against the sawdust-covered floor. Their antics were exaggerated, their laughter too loud and too forced. The children in the audience laughed along, but the adults exchanged uneasy glances. There was something wrong with these clowns, something deeply unsettling. And then the lights dimmed, and a single spotlight illuminated the center ring. The ringmaster, a tall, gaunt man with a voice like gravel, stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," he intoned, "prepare yourselves for the main event, the one, the only, Clown 5000. The crowd erupted into applause, but it was tinged with nervousness. The air grew colder, and the stench that had been lingering at the edges of their awareness grew stronger. The calliope music swelled, and then with a deafening crash, Clown 5000 appeared. It was even more grotesque than the poster had suggested. Its face was a mask of exaggerated features, its mouth stretched into a rictus grin that revealed rows of sharp yellowed teeth. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and its body was a patchwork of mismatched fabrics, sewn together with thick, black thread. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its limbs bending in ways that defied human anatomy. The audience was frozen in terror as Clown 5000 began its performance. It juggled knives with deadly precision, the blades flashing in the spotlight. It performed acrobatic feats that were impossible for any human, contorting its body in ways that made the audience's stomachs churn. And all the while it laughed, a high-pitched, manic sound that echoed through the Big Top. But the worst was yet to come. Clown 5000 suddenly stopped its performance and turned its glowing eyes on the audience. It raised a hand, and the calliope music stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening. "Who wants to play a game?" it asked, its voice a guttural growl that sent shivers down the spines of everyone present.
No one moved, no one breathed.
Clown 5000's grin widened, and it pointed a long, bony finger at a young boy in the front row. "You," it said, "come here." The boy's parents tried to hold him back, but he was drawn forward as if by an invisible force. He stumbled into the center ring, his face pale with terror.
"Ooh."
Clown 5000 knelt down, its face inches from the boy's. "Do you want to play a game?" it asked again. The boy shook his head, tears streaming down his face. Clown 5000's grin widened even further, and it reached out a hand to touch the boy's cheek. But before it could make contact, A voice rang out from the audience.
Leave him alone.
It was the boy's father, a burly man with a face red with anger. He stormed into the ring, his fists clenched. You touch my son, and I'll... He never finished his sentence. Clown 5000 moved faster than the eye could follow, its hand shooting out and grabbing the man by the throat. It lifted him off the ground as if he weighed nothing, its grip tightening until the man's face turned purple. The audience screamed, but no one moved to help. They were frozen in terror, unable to look away. Clown 5000 leaned in close to the man's face, its grin never wavering. You shouldn't have interrupted, it said. Then with a sickening crunch, it snapped the man's neck and dropped his lifeless body to the ground. The boy screamed and tried to run, but Clown 5000 caught him with ease. It lifted him into the air, its glowing eyes boring into his.
Let's play,
it said. The audience finally broke, people scrambling over each other to escape the big top, but the exits were sealed, the heavy canvas flaps impossible to move. They were trapped. Clown 5000 began to laugh, a sound that echoed through the big top and seemed to come from all directions at once. It set the boy down and turned its attention to the rest of the audience. Who's next? It asked, its voice dripping with malice. The night descended into chaos. Clown 5000 moved through the crowd like a predator, its grotesque form twisting and contorting as it hunted its prey. It was unstoppable, its strength and speed far beyond that of any human. The townsfolk fought back, but their efforts were futile. Clown 5000 was a force of nature, a nightmare made flesh. By the time the sun rose, the big top was silent. The ground was littered with bodies, their faces frozen in expressions of terror.
Oh!
Clown 5000 was gone, leaving behind only the stench of death and the memory of its laughter. The circus disappeared as quickly as it had arrived, the big top and all its horrors vanishing without a trace. The Clown. Part 2. The town was never the same after that night. The survivors spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously at every shadow. The authorities had come and gone, their investigations yielding nothing but more questions. The circus had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the blood-stained sawdust and the lingering stench of death. Months passed and the town tried to move on. The children no longer played in the streets, and the adults avoided the field where the big top had stood. But the memory of Clown 5000 was always there, lurking in the back of their minds, a constant reminder of the horror they had endured. Then one day the posters appeared again. They were identical to the ones from before, the same garish colors and shifting images. The townsfolk stared at them in disbelief, their hearts pounding with fear. The circus was coming back. Panic spread through the town like wildfire. People packed their belongings and fled, leaving behind their homes and livelihoods, but not everyone could leave. Some were too poor, too old, or too stubborn to abandon the only life they had ever known. Among those who stayed was Sarah, a young woman who had lost her brother in the massacre. She had been haunted by nightmares ever since, her sleep plagued by visions of Clown 5000's grotesque face. She had vowed to uncover the truth behind the circus and put an end to the nightmare once and for all. Sarah spent her days researching, scouring old newspapers and books for any mention of the circus. She found nothing, as if the circus had never existed. But then she stumbled upon an old dusty tome in the town's library. It was a book of local legends, and in its pages she found a story that sent chills down her spine. The legend spoke of a cursed circus that had roamed the countryside for centuries, its performers not human but something far more sinister. The circus was said to be led by a malevolent entity known only as the Master, a being of unimaginable power and cruelty. The Master's favorite creation was a clown, a monstrous creature that delighted in tormenting and killing its victims. The clown was known by many names, but one stood out: Clown 5000. According to the legend, the circus would appear in a town, lure the inhabitants with promises of entertainment, and then unleash its horrors. The Master would feed on the fear and despair of the victims, growing stronger with each life it claimed. The circus would then vanish, only to reappear in another town, repeating the cycle of terror. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the legend. It was all too real, too close to what had happened in her town. She knew she had to act, but she had no idea how to stop something as powerful as the Master and its monstrous clown. That night, Sarah had a dream. She was standing in the center of the big top, the air thick with the scent of blood and decay. Clown 5000 was there, its glowing eyes fixed on her. It reached out a hand, its grotesque grin widening. "Join us," it said, its voice a guttural growl. "Become part of the show." Sarah woke up screaming, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. She had to confront the circus, no matter the cost. The next day, Sarah gathered what supplies she could and set out for the field where the circus had appeared before. The townsfolk watched her go, their faces filled with fear and pity. They knew she was walking to her doom, but no one tried to stop her. As Sarah approached the field, she saw the big top rising in the distance, its red and white stripes pulsing in the fading light. The air was thick with the scent of popcorn and cotton candy, but there was an underlying stench, something foul and unidentifiable. Sarah's heart pounded as she stepped inside the big top. The interior was exactly as she remembered. The sawdust-covered floor and the rows of empty seats. The calliope music played in the background, eerie and discordant. She walked to the center ring, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Then the lights dimmed, and a single spotlight illuminated the ring. The ringmaster stepped forward, his gaunt face twisted into a cruel smile. "Welcome, Sarah," he said, his voice like gravel. "We've been expecting you." Sarah's blood ran cold. She tried to speak, but no words came out. The ringmaster gestured to the shadows and Clown 5000 stepped into the light. Its grotesque face was even more horrifying up close, its glowing eyes boring into her. "You shouldn't have come," Clown 5000 said, its voice a guttural growl. "But now that you're here, you'll never leave." Sarah's mind raced. She had to think of something, anything, to stop the nightmare. She remembered the legend and the mention of the master. If she could find and confront the master, maybe she could end the curse. "Where is the master?" she demanded, her voice trembling but defiant. Clown 5000's grin widened, and it let out a high-pitched manic laugh. "The master is everywhere," it said, "but if you want to meet him, you'll have to play the game." Sarah's heart pounded as Clown 5000 raised a hand and the calliope music stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening. "Who wants to play a game?" it asked, its voice dripping with malice. Sarah knew she had no choice. She had to play along if she wanted to find the master. She nodded, her eyes never leaving Clown 5000's grotesque face. Clown 5000's grin widened and it reached out a hand to touch her cheek, but before it could make contact, Sarah pulled out a small silver dagger she had hidden in her pocket. She had found it in the old tome, a weapon said to be capable of harming the supernatural. With a cry of desperation, she plunged the dagger into Clown 5000's chest. The creature let out a deafening scream, its glowing eyes widening in shock and pain. It stumbled back, its grotesque form writhing and twisting as black smoke poured from the wound. Sarah didn't wait to see what would happen next. She turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to find the master, to end the curse once and for all. The big top seemed to stretch on forever, the rows of seats and the sawdust-covered floor blending together in a nightmarish blur. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as she ran, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of the master. Then she saw a figure stood in the center of the ring, its form shrouded in darkness. As Sarah approached, the figure turned to face her, and she felt a wave of terror wash over her. The master was unlike anything she had ever seen. Its form was constantly shifting, a mass of writhing shadows and glowing. Its voice was a cacophony of screams and whispers, each word sending shivers down her spine. "You dare to challenge me?" the master asked, its voice echoing through the big top. Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the silver dagger. She knew she had no chance against the master, but she had to try. She had to end the nightmare. With a cry of desperation, she lunged at the master, the dagger aimed at his heart. But before she could strike, the master raised a hand and Sarah was thrown back with a force that knocked the breath from her lungs. She hit the ground hard, the dagger slipping from her grasp. The master loomed over her, its form shifting and writhing as it prepared to deliver the final blow. But then something unexpected happened. Clown 5000 appeared, its grotesque form still writhing from the wound Sarah had inflicted. It let out a deafening scream and lunged at the master, its glowing eyes filled with rage. The two entities clashed, their forms twisting and contorting. As they fought, the big top shook with the force of their battle, the air filled with the sound of screams and laughter. Sarah watched in horror as the two monsters tore each other apart, their forms dissolving into black smoke. The big top began to collapse, the walls and ceiling crumbling. The curse was broken. Sarah scrambled to her feet and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. She burst out of the big top just as it collapsed. Lights in on itself, the red and white stripes disappearing into a cloud of dust and smoke. The field was silent, the only sound the distant calliope music fading into nothingness. Sarah fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. It was over. The nightmare was finally over. But as she looked up, she saw something that sent a chill down her spine. In the distance, a single poster fluttered in the wind. It was the same garish colors and shifting images, the same grotesque clown with glowing eyes, and beneath it, in dripping blood-red letters, were the words "coming soon." Sarah's heart sank as she realized the truth. The curse was not broken. The nightmare was far from over, and somewhere, in the darkness, Clown 5000 waited, its glowing eyes scanning the horizon for its next victims. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the sprawling fields of the old Henderson farm. The air was thick with the scent of hay and the distant murmur of crickets. It was a peaceful place, or so it seemed. The farm had been in the Henderson family for generations, a quiet haven far from the noise of the city. But tonight the peace would be shattered. The farmhouse stood at the center of the property, its white paint peeling and its porch sagging with age. Inside, the Henderson family was gathered around the dinner table. Old man Henderson sat at the head, his weathered face creased with years of hard work. His wife, Martha, sat to his right, her hands busy with a bowl of mashed potatoes. Their son, Tommy, a lanky teenager with a mop of unruly hair, sat across from them, shoveling food into his mouth with the enthusiasm of a boy who had spent the day working in the fields. "Slow down, Tommy." Martha chided gently, but her words were lost on the boy. He was too busy thinking about the upcoming harvest and the promise of a new tractor his father had mentioned. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the old oak tree that stood sentinel by the barn. The barn itself was a hulking structure, its red paint faded to a dull pink. It had seen better days, but it was still sturdy, still useful. Inside, the faint sound of shuffling footsteps echoed through the empty space. The animals had been put to bed hours ago, and the barn was supposed to be empty, but it wasn't. In the far corner, hidden in the shadows, a figure stood motionless. He was tall, his broad shoulders filling out the dark jacket he wore. His face was obscured by a hockey mask, the kind kids wore on the ice, but this was no child. The mask was scratched and dirty, the eye holes dark and empty. In his hand he held a machete, its blade glinting faintly in the dim light that filtered through the cracks in the barn walls. The killer had been watching the farm for days, studying the routines of the family, learning their habits. He knew when they ate, when they slept, when they were most vulnerable. He had chosen tonight to make his move. The Hendersons were simple folk, unsuspecting and unprepared for what was coming. Inside the house, dinner was winding down. Martha stood to clear the table, her movements slow and deliberate. Tommy pushed his chair back with a loud scrape and announced he was going to check on the animals before bed. Old man Henderson grunted in acknowledgement, his attention already turned to the newspaper in his hands. Tommy grabbed a flashlight from the hook by the door and stepped out into the night. The air was cool and the moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the farm. He whistled a tuneless melody as he made his way to the barn, the beam of his flashlight bouncing ahead of him. The barn door creaked as he pushed it open, the sound loud in the stillness of the night. He stepped inside, the beam of his flashlight sweeping across the empty stalls. Everything seemed normal, but something felt off. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. There was no answer, but he thought he heard a faint shuffling sound from the far corner. He swung the flashlight in that direction, but the beam didn't reach far enough to illuminate the shadows. "Anyone there?" he called again, his voice trembling slightly. He took a step forward, then another, his heart pounding in his chest. The shuffling sound came again, louder this time, and he froze. His flashlight flickered, the beam dimming for a moment before coming back to life. And then he saw it. The figure stepped out of the shadows, his hockey mask gleaming in the dim light. Tommy's breath caught in his throat, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The man was huge, his presence filling the space, and the machete in his hand looked deadly sharp. Tommy's first instinct was to run, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The killer took a step forward, then another, his movements slow and deliberate. Tommy's flashlight slipped from his fingers, hitting the ground with a loud clatter, rolling away, the beam casting strange shadows on the walls. The killer was on him in an instant, his hand closing around Tommy's throat with a grip like iron. Tommy struggled, his hands clawing at the killer's arm, but it was no use. The man was too strong. He lifted Tommy off the ground, his feet kicking uselessly in the air, then slammed him against the wall with a sickening thud. Tommy's vision blurred, his lungs burning for air. He could feel the killer's breath on his face, hot and rancid, and he could see the cold, empty eyes behind the mask. The machete came up, the blade catching the faint light, and then it came down. Inside the house, Martha was washing the dishes, her hands moving mechanically in the soapy water. Old man Henderson was still at the table, his newspaper forgotten as he stared out the window at the dark fields. He thought he heard a faint scream, but he wasn't sure. It could have been the wind, or maybe an animal. He shook his head and stood, stretching his stiff muscles. "I'm going to bed," he announced, his voice gruff. Martha nodded absently, her mind already on the next day's chores. She didn't notice when her husband left the room or when he paused at the window, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. The killer moved silently through the barn, his boots making no sound on the dirt floor. He left Tommy's body where it had fallen, the blood pooling around it, and made his way to the door. He had more work to do. The farmhouse was his next target. He had watched the family long enough to know their routines, to know when they were most vulnerable. He stepped out into the night, the moon casting long shadows across the yard. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves of the old oak tree, but the killer paid it no mind. He had a job to do. Inside the house, Martha was drying the last of the dishes when she heard a noise from the front porch. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make her pause. She set the dish towel down and turned toward the door, her heart suddenly pounding in her chest. "Tommy," she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer. She took a step toward the door, then another, her hand reaching for the knob. She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to stop, but she couldn't help herself. She had to know. She opened the door a crack, peering out into the darkness. The porch was empty, but the swing was moving slightly, as if someone had just been sitting there. She stepped out, her bare feet cold on the wooden planks, and looked around. The yard was quiet, the only sound the rustling of the leaves in the wind. And then she saw him. The killer stepped out of the shadows, his hockey mask gleaming in the moonlight. Martha's breath caught in her throat, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. She opened her mouth to scream, but the killer was on her before she could make a sound. His hand closed around her throat, cutting off her air, and he lifted her off the ground as if she weighed nothing. She struggled, her hands clawing at his arm, but it was no use. He slammed her against the wall of the house, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. The machete came up, the blade catching the moonlight, and then it came down. Old man Henderson was in the bedroom pulling off his boots when he heard the scream. It was short, cut off abruptly, but it was enough to make his blood run cold. He grabbed the shotgun from the corner of the room and hurried to the door, his heart pounding in his chest. "Martha," he called out, his voice shaking. There was no answer. He stepped out into the hallway, the shotgun raised and ready, and made his way to the front door. It was open, the cold night air rushing in, and he could see Martha's body lying on the porch, her blood staining the wooden planks. His breath caught in his throat, his mind refusing to accept what he was seeing. He stepped out onto the porch, his eyes scanning the yard, but there was no one there. The killer had vanished into the night, but he wasn't gone. The killer watched from the shadows, his cold eyes fixed on the old man. He had planned this carefully, and he wasn't about to let anyone escape. He stepped out into the moonlight, his machete gleaming, and moved toward the house. Old man Henderson heard the footsteps and turned, his shotgun raised. He saw the killer coming, his heart pounding in his chest, and he fired. The blast echoed through the night, but the killer didn't stop. He kept coming, his pace steady, his eyes locked on the old man. Henderson fired again and again, but the killer didn't falter. He was like a force of nature, unstoppable and relentless. Henderson backed into the house, his hands trembling as he fumbled for more shells, but he was too slow. The killer was on him, and in his machete coming down in a deadly arc. The house fell silent, the only sound the rustling of the leaves in the wind. The killer stood in the doorway, his mask splattered with blood, his machete dripping. He looked around the room, his cold eyes taking in the carnage, and then he turned and walked out into the night. The farm was quiet once more, the only sound the distant murmur of the crickets. The killer disappeared into the shadows, his work done. The Henderson family was gone, their peaceful life snuffed out in a single night, and somewhere in the darkness the killer waited, his hockey mask gleaming in the moonlight, ready for his next victim. The night was far from over. The killer moved silently through the fields, his boots crunching softly on the dry grass. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. He had left the Henderson farm behind, but his thirst for blood was far from quenched. The quiet countryside was vast, and there were other farms, other families, other victims. He had no name, no identity. He was a shadow, a phantom, a force of nature. The hockey mask hid his face, but it also hid his humanity, if he had ever possessed any. He was a machine, a predator, and tonight he was on the hunt. The next farm was only a mile away, a small property owned by the Millers. The Millers were a young couple, new to the area, and they had no idea what was coming. The killer had watched them too, studying their routines, learning their habits. He knew they were alone, with no children, no pets, no one to raise the alarm. They were perfect. The farmhouse was small, a quaint little building with a white picket fence and a well-tended garden. The lights were off, the windows dark. The Millers were asleep, unaware of the danger lurking just outside their door. The killer moved silently across the yard, his machete glinting in the moonlight. He paused at the front door, his head tilting slightly as he listened. There was no sound from inside, no movement. He reached for the doorknob, turning it slowly, carefully. The door was unlocked. He stepped inside, his boots making no sound on the wooden floor. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. He moved through the living room, his eyes scanning the shadows, his machete held ready. The bedroom was at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar. The killer pushed it open, his cold eyes taking in the scene. The Millers were asleep, their bodies tangled together under the blankets. They looked peaceful, innocent, unaware of the monster standing over them. The killer raised his machete, the blade catching the faint light from the window. He brought it down in a swift, brutal arc, the sound of the impact muffled by the blankets. The Millers never woke up. The killer stood over the bed, his mask splattered with blood, his chest rising and falling with slow, even breaths. He looked down at the bodies, his cold eyes unreadable. Then he turned and walked out of the room, leaving the carnage behind. The night was still young, and there were more farms, more families, more victims. The killer moved silently through the darkness, his machete gleaming in the moonlight. He was a shadow, a phantom, a force of nature, and he was just getting started. The next farm was larger, a sprawling property owned by the Carters. The Carters were an older couple with 2 grown children who had moved away. They lived alone, but they were not defenseless. Old Man Carter was a hunter, and he kept a rifle by the bed. His wife, a tough, no-nonsense woman, had a pistol in the nightstand. They were prepared for trouble, but they were not prepared for the killer. The killer moved through the fields, his boots crunching softly on the dry grass. He had watched the Carters too, studying their routines, learning new habits. He knew they were cautious, but he also knew they were no match for him. The farmhouse was a large 2-story building with a wide porch and a barn out back. The lights were off, the windows dark. The Carters were asleep, unaware of the danger lurking just outside their door. The killer moved silently across the yard, his machete glinting in the moonlight. He paused at the front door, his head tilting slightly as he listened. There was no sound from inside, no movement. He reached for the doorknob, turning it slowly, carefully. The door was locked. He stepped back, his cold eyes scanning the house. There were other ways in. He moved around to the side of the house, his boots making no sound on the grass. He found a window, the glass fogged with condensation. He reached up, his fingers finding the latch, and pushed it open. The window slid up with a faint creak, and the killer climbed inside, his boots landing softly on the floor. He was in the kitchen, the room dark and silent. He moved through the house, his machete held ready, his cold eyes scanning the shadows. The Carters' bedroom was on the 2nd floor, at the end of the hall. The killer moved silently up the stairs, his boots making no sound on the wooden steps. He paused at the top, his head tilting slightly as he listened. There was no sound from inside the bedroom, no movement. He pushed the door open, his cold eyes taking in the scene. The Carters were asleep, their bodies tangled together under the blankets. Old Man Carter's rifle was propped against the wall within arm's reach. His wife's pistol was in the nightstand, just inches from her hand. They were prepared, but they were no match for the killer. He raised his machete, the blade catching the faint light from the window. He brought it down in a swift, brutal arc, the sound of the impact muffled by the blankets. Old Man Carter never woke up. His wife stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She saw the killer standing over the bed, his mask splattered with blood, his machete raised. She reached for the nightstand, her fingers closing around the pistol, but she was too slow. The killer brought the machete down again, and she was gone. The killer stood over the bed, his chest rising and falling with slow, even breaths. He looked down at the bodies, his cold eyes unreadable. Then he turned and walked out of the room, leaving the carnage behind. The night was still young, and there were more farms, more families, more victims. The killer moved silently through the darkness, his machete gleaming in the moonlight. He was a shadow, a phantom, a force of nature, and he was just getting started. The next farm was smaller, a modest property owned by the Wilsons. The Wilsons were a young family, with 2 small children and a dog. They were new to the area, and they had no idea what was coming. The killer had watched them too, studying their routines, learning their habits. He knew they were vulnerable, but he also knew they would fight. The farmhouse was a small single-story building with a wide porch and a swing out front. The lights were off, the windows dark. The Wilsons were asleep, unaware of the danger lurking just outside their door. The killer moved silently across the yard, his machete glinting in the moonlight. He paused at the front door, his head tilting slightly as he listened. There was no sound from inside, no movement. He reached for the doorknob, turning it slowly, carefully. The door was unlocked. He stepped inside, his boots making no sound on the wooden floor. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. He moved through the living room, his eyes scanning the shadows, his machete held ready. The Wilsons' bedroom was at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar. The killer pushed it open, his cold eyes taking in the scene. The Wilsons were asleep, their bodies tangled together under the blankets. The children were in the next room, their door closed. The dog was asleep on the floor at the foot of the bed. The killer raised his machete, the blade catching the faint light from the window. He brought it down in a swift, brutal arc, the sound of the impact muffled by the blankets. Wilson never woke up. His wife stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She saw the killer standing over the bed, his mask splattered with blood, his machete raised. She opened her mouth to scream, but the killer was on her before she could make a sound. The dog woke up, barking furiously, but it was too late. The killer brought the machete down again, and Mrs. Wilson was gone. The dog lunged at the killer, its teeth bared, but the killer was ready. He swung the machete, the blade slicing through the air, and the dog fell silent. The killer stood over the bed, his chest rising and falling with slow, even breaths. He looked down at the bodies, his cold eyes unreadable. Then he turned and walked out of the room, leaving the carnage behind. The children's room was next. The killer pushed the door open, his cold eyes taking in the scene. The children were asleep, their faces peaceful, innocent. They had no idea what had just happened, no idea what was coming. The killer raised his machete, the blade catching the faint light from the window. He brought it down in a swift, brutal arc, and the room fell silent. The night was still young, and there were more farms, more families, more victims. The killer moved silently through the darkness, his machete gleaming in the moonlight. He was a shadow, a phantom, a force of nature, and he was just getting started. The next farm was larger, a sprawling property owned by the Harrisons. The Harrisons were an older couple, with 3 grown children who had moved away. They lived alone, but they were not defenseless. Old man Harrison was a retired cop, and he kept a shotgun by the bed. His wife, a tough, no-nonsense woman, had a pistol in the nightstand. They were prepared for trouble, but they were not prepared for the killer. The killer moved through the fields, his boots crunching softly on the dry grass. He had watched the Harrisons too, studying their routines, learning their habits. He knew they were cautious, but he also knew they were no match for him. The farmhouse was a large, 2-story building with a wide porch and a barn out back. The lights were off, the windows dark. The Harrisons